Number 3. I alluded to it earlier, but there was indeed a time in my life where my Game Boy Pocket had completely taken over as my console of choice. One Christmas, I received it with a copy of the 2 Mario Land games. I'm quite fond of both, though these are not the games I will be talking about. I remember that I wanted a copy of Pokémon so bad when I got my Game Boy, but I would have to make do with the toys, books and cards first. I was still in my single digits when Pokémania swept the nation in 1999. The anime had started airing every Saturday morning on ITV. I remember being one of the first kids to get into Pokémon at my school. I have very clear memories of bringing to school a toy Pikachu and being surrounded for the whole day, being asked questions about Pokémon names. I remember not having the confidence to say, I don't know, regarding Pokémon like Geodude, who I said was called Rocky. I was a funny kid. Anyway, as Pokémania spread to our playgrounds, I eventually fell behind. I didn't have a lot of toys. They mysteriously vanished. I can't remember where my sticker albums went. The only trading cards I had were the ones my dad would bring home because he found them on the buses he was driving. I remember very soon, before schools decided to ban Pokémon, I traded a rare Japanese Venusaur card for a huge stack of cards from a friend. And then the ban hit. Suddenly kids weren't allowed to bring things to school anymore. It was very weird. And this is when everything kind of becomes a blur. I remember being lightly exposed to the games from those who had them, but I never had a copy to call my own. That changed one summer when my parents received a large amount of money and decided to treat us all. I finally got a copy of Red, even though I wanted Blue, and many trading card game decks. So if I wasn't at school, I was in my bedroom playing Pokémon until Sonic came back into my life. The reason I'm talking about these specific memories is because I really cannot remember much of my first ever playthrough of the game. I can remember little bits and bobs, like some of my Pokémon nicknames, the fact I chose Squirtle as my starter because I liked all of the blue Pokémon. I just can't pinpoint specific times I discovered things about the game, because Pokémon feels so deeply embedded into my brain that it all feels like deja vu. Even when I played the game for the first time, I got this feeling of deja vu. Was it the anime coming first? Was it the merch? Was it playground word of mouth? Was it a book I read? I think I might have read a guide for Pokémon Yellow before ever playing Red, because I do remember knowing exactly what to do and where to go and what was going to happen. I think this guide was written like a diary of sorts, like a first-person perspective on the Gen 1 journey, but I can't find any books that match this description. But it gave me the knowledge going in on every last detail, right down to the potion hidden in the tree in Viridian City. The more I try to think of the first time I played Pokémon, I just remember more and more that each element was shown to me first from an external source. I was even told about talking to the old man and swimming up and down Cinnabar to make Missing No duplicate your 6th item before I ever finished it. It's very surreal, not being able to remember your first play of a game. Maybe this has something to do with the length of time spent on such a game? It is an RPG after all. I just have very small and specific memories. Using the item duplication glitch to buy myself a Porygon, for example. Or the time I had gotten to Mewtwo only to find that my PC boxes were full. I think after I finished it for the first time, I kept loading it up every day for a year to see if the SS Anne would ever return to let me catch the fabled Mew under the truck. Thank you to whoever told me that one. But what I do remember were the many long days spent playing the game after having access to the internet. I know that once we had a PC and a connection to the internet, I was able to look up all the real cheats and glitches, and this was the start of a fascination with glitches that has stayed with me forever. What was once a structured and difficult game became my open playground to do whatever I wanted, and what I wanted was to catch all 151 Pokémon. So I did just that. I learnt how to catch a level 7 Mew at Nugget Bridge using a glitch where you teleport away from a trainer before they spot you. You go and battle somebody, teleport again and encounter a Pokemon based on the special stat of the last Pokemon you fought. I did this for every single trainer in the game that I possibly could. I can't tell you how long it took me, but I know I did it 3 times. Once when I was a kid, then twice when I was a young adult on a copy of Red and Blue. The Gen 1 games are fascinating to me, and I feel very conflicted calling these my favourite Pokémon games when there are much more polished games in the series. How can it be that a game can be both high quality and completely broken, but not to the point where it completely ruins the game for the player? I have had some time to think about other generations of Pokémon, their pros and cons in comparison to Gen 1, and at the risk of being called a Gen 1er, I think that I can explain why I think Gen 1 is still the best overall. There are two other Pokémon games I think highly of, and for their own reasons. Gold, Silver and Crystal are more polished, magical games that I played when I was a young adult. I loved their improved graphics and the music was just as good as Red and Blue's. However, I feel like Gen 2 are smaller games by comparison. It feels like the world is smaller, routes to other towns feel tiny, and while you may be able to go back to Kanto after the main adventure, I do remember being very disappointed by what I found there, and most of the new Pokémon just didn't feel good, no matter how cool their designs were, and the story didn't feel as high stakes. The other games I have high regard for are the Gen 5 games, Black and White. I thought at the time that they had the best story, as it was more involved this time round, with animated cutscenes too. It was also the first time I had no knowledge of the Pokédex going in, with 151 brand new Pokémon. Gen 5 truly took me back to the mystery and discovery of Gen 1. However, it was also the start of Pokémon becoming easier. This is the game where they started putting more healing NPCs along the routes you'd be travelling, the very linear routes. And yes, Pokémon is one of those series that technically keeps getting better. Special Split, Dark and Steel, abilities, special and physical attack splits, weather, time, the fairy type, Mega Evolution, regional forms, these are all things that make the core loop of catching, raising and battling new Pokémon more fun and strategic. Battling Pokémon and testing my knowledge is definitely the biggest draw of this series for me, and the later games certainly make that side of it more accessible. It is easier than ever to raise a strong battle team, and catching Pokémon is also easier than ever. However, I no longer feel compelled to in these 3D games because the main adventures feel mindlessly linear, lack challenge and have uncompelling stories. No Pokémon game story has gripped me quite like Gen 1's. We've gotten some splashes of darkness here and there since, but really, Gen 1 is kind of a miracle. I don't think we'll ever get a kids game quite this dark ever again from the series. And it's not just Lavender Town and the Pokémon Tower I'm talking about either, it's all the implied stuff too. Mr. Fuji and Blaine's involvement in the creation of Mewtwo, and what happened in the Pokémon Mansion, Agatha and Oak's relationship, being able to gamble in the game corner, taking on a criminal organisation and being tempted by evil, the fact that your best friend was kind of a dick. Sending a 12-year-old on such a coming-of-age story felt very real when I was the same age, a time of my life where I was expected to make my own choices and do things on my own. Gen 1 feels so much more like it wants you to grow as a person by the end of it all. I really can't connect with any other game in the series in the same way as this one. Maybe everyone feels this way about their first Pokémon though. I'm curious to hear. There truly was something special about finding out that the 8th gym leader was Giovanni, and upon beating him, he decides to change his ways because you reminded him of the thrill of bonding with and battling Pokémon. The music too, I feel is pure bliss, magic. I don't know how they managed to make such amazing music with the Game Boy's limitations, but they genuinely feel like timeless, classical melodies. It's hard not to get emotional when listening to this OST, and again, it's harder for me to vibe with later Pokémon music. I also feel that Gen 1 was the closest we got to an open world Pokémon game before Scarlet and Violet. Without glitches, if you speed through the game until you get surf, the world becomes fully open for you. I just love surfing to various places early. I usually find myself disappointed backtracking with it in later games. And with glitches, the game becomes your open playground to do whatever you wish. Just try not to corrupt your save file. I recently enjoyed watching a YouTuber called Imported Cheese do a whole video series on Pokémon Green, the original Japanese version, which is even more broken than the game we got, and as well as being very funny and entertaining, some of the tricks shown off took me back to my childhood. That fascination with glitches has lived on in me, as I'd always be looking for bugs and glitches in any future games I played. Now that I am a game developer, I am having all new fun discovering glitches and exploits in my own project. Some of them even become features. And while Gen 1 isn't the most challenging game in the series, I feel like Gen 3 might have been the game where I really had to grind out my levels before the Elite Four. It certainly has its moments and quirks that make it hard without glitches and exploits. Quirks that are available for you to exploit though. Gen 1 still feels like a complete package for what I want out of a Pokémon game. If I was a fan of the Game Boy Advance's music, I might be saying this about FireRed or LeafGreen, but the original compositions have a lot of charm which gets lost in the hardware transition for me. I have always been underwhelmed by Gen 3. And while I would unfortunately state that Let's Go Eevee or Pikachu are still the highest quality traditional Pokemon games on the Switch, they cut way too many modern features for me to consider that a definitive remake either. Plus, that game is a remake of Yellow. I never liked Yellow. I didn't like the anime anymore when I played it, and I was rather disappointed by its additions. A Crystal or Platinum, Yellow ain't. So with all that in mind, and considering it is the Pokemon game I have replayed the most in my life, I hope to have explained why Red or Blue is not just my favourite Pokemon game, but my third favourite game of all time.